Today is March 2nd, 2023. My name is Kevin. I'm with the Houston Asian American Archive. I'll be talking today with Mr. Nathan Hill. He's a musician, artist, and teacher of literature and language arts. So thanks so much again for taking the time out of your day to talk with me.
Yeah, thank you.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the interview, just like to ask, when and where were you born?
I was born here in Houston, Texas, September 1, 1985.
And, growing up in Houston, did you like it here? Did you wish you grew up somewhere else, perhaps?
I mean, I don't know if this is like normal, but I tend to like take a really nuanced view. I mean, I think most people who grow up in a place, there's good and there's bad. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't a bad place to grow up. In a lot of ways, it was a really excellent place to grow up. Perfect. Not really, but but awesome just the same.
So, growing up here in Houston, can you tell me a bit about kind of like the elementary and middle schools that you went to, kind of your early educational experiences, like which schools you went to and any experiences you had there?
Yeah, sure. I went to Parker Elementary School, which was the neighborhood, public school, so just down the street. I don't actually have, I guess I do have some memories, vague memories of walking to school. So, I mean, it was definitely close enough to walk. So I'd be surprised if I wasn't walking every single day. But I feel like maybe I got dropped off sometimes. But they had a really robust music programs as far as like, music goes. They were not unwell known. I remember my piano teacher really well, Miss Booker. And, I tell people, I don't know detail, so I can't really go into detail about it. But if I'm not mistaken, I think Beyonce also went to Parker Elementary. And I believe she was there at the same time I was there. I didn't know her because she was a few years older than me. But, it was a nice place. Like I said, neighborhood school, the people were friendly. Most of my memories from Parker actually do have to do with music, piano, like the music room. Probably, one of the first really public recitals that I remember was through the music program at Parker, and I was playing piano on this like raised dais at the Galleria. This was before like Galleria 4 was built. So if you know Houston and you know the Galleria really well, I think it's where the large circular fountain is now, the one that like drops water from the ceiling. Like before that was there used to be, I think it was in that location, but there used to be like a raised dais. And so I remember, one day I got to get out of class and we took a field trip over there, and me and 2 or 3 of the other piano students, and set up shop and basically played there pretty much all day for the shoppers. It was a pretty cool experience. So no, it was a great experience actually. Parker. Middle school, I went from public to private, and I think that's a little bit unusual actually. The fact that I jigsawed really my entire education between public and private. So middle school, I went to a private school. It was also very religious, an Episcopalian school, St. Thomas. The kind of school where we went to church every single day, and as a part of the curriculum. I mean, as a part of the school life, not necessarily as a part of the curriculum, but we went to church every day. And as a result, music was also a strong part of the culture there, because of course, church. So, I want to say it was in 7th grade, maybe at the beginning of 7th grade when I joined the choir there. And so that was actually the beginning of my singing. And that's like primarily what I ended up doing with music, I think, was voice, even though I started with piano. And so that came out of middle school though. And, once I joined the choir, and I actually did that for kind of mercenary reasons, as I recall. Because if you were in the choir, of course, you got to sit up, at the front of the church in the choir, and the seats were more comfortable than in the pews. And then also, there's also a lot of stuff going on in the pews with a bunch of 12 and 13-year-old kids. And so the teachers are always walking up and down the aisles. And I just remember it being kind of tense down in the congregational area. So it was kind of like a little bit mercenary. I wanted to sit in the cushy seats and just kind of be away from all the drama that usually ensued under the radar. Which is why I ended up joining choir, but then it ended up being a really, really great experience. I loved the director. I can't for the life of me recall his name, but I remember his face really well. I remember the organist, Mr. Schultz. He actually invited a few of us who were in the choir over one day to his house because he had this old organ, I remember, that was like totally falling to pieces. And so we actually helped rebuild it. So I got inside the organ and was like putting little gears back together and including little hammers and things. It was pretty cool. That was a pretty cool experience too. So, like musically, especially, I remember really good things from elementary and middle school. And of course, just in life overall, they were perfectly fine places to be. I don't know if you have like more specific things you want to know about those schools. Like, I'm sure there's plenty to tell, so just ask. But those are kind of like my memories of how it went down musically, at least in a general sense. So
Yeah. So, and Parker's this like music magnet school, I believe, right?
I actually don't know. It may be.
Well, anyways, like the program, like they have pretty robust music programs. So
I remember it was strong. Yeah.
okay. Would you say that I'm assuming your parents had a pretty supportive role in your musical endeavors as a child and beyond?
Yeah. I mean, overall, yes, absolutely. Especially early on. I mean, like piano, for instance, of course, I didn't really have a choice. That was my choice to do piano. They were very much of the, I don't think, I guess people still do this. I feel like people aren't quite as much like this anymore, but at least back in those days, it was, I think for many people, it was considered really important to, as you're educating a child, to make sure that that child gets an extremely well-rounded education. And so I think that was what was on my parents' mind at the time. And, I don't think they ever wanted me to like just do music. That wasn't their purpose, but, piano, it was a part of my education for sure. And I had no choice in that early on, which, thank God. I mean, since I ended up really falling in love with everything about it. So yeah, I mean, yeah, they were very supportive. And then of course, joining the choir and singing at churches. I mean, I don't know many parents who wouldn't be okay with that or supportive of that kind of endeavor. So yeah, it was a little bit later on, I think, when I got to high school and started kind of exploring music in some more alternative ways. I don't want to say they weren't supportive, but it was a little bit harder to see all the time, I think, for them, all the positives. But
I can imagine.
that's fair. I don't know, Mom, if you're seeing this.
So, you mentioned in high school you got into the more alternative side of music. So, growing up then, did you have any like favorite musical artists and by alternative, what do you mean by that once you got to high school?
Alternative in that, not conservatory type music. And it's weird because I actually think I was taught using the Suzuki method early on, which is strange because I don't think that that's very common anymore. I think it's really rare, actually. I think, but I don't, like I said, I kind of dipped out of the conservatory track like really early on, once I discovered, you know, these other kinds of music. But yeah, you know, it was it was I was actually just talking to my dad about this the other day. Like, I'm trying to remember the first songs, the very first. I started playing guitar also in middle school, I believe. I started teaching myself. I want to say I took a couple lessons early on, but mostly guitar is self-taught for me. And that was really how I discovered these alternative forms of music, I think. And I'm trying to remember who I was listening to at the time. One of the first songs I ever learned was Push, I think, by Matchbox 20. I started learning some, you know, Red Hot Chili Peppers early on. I want to say Californication was probably the second or third song I learned on the guitar. Um, you know, shoot, who else? I was into a lot of rock bands. You know, Blink 182 was really relevant at the time for 13-year-olds. Green Day, of course, like all the pop punk bands. Um, I was a huge fan of Lit for a long time. Lit is an old rock band. They used to be everywhere, but I feel like nobody knows them anymore. You know, I want to say 311 was already on the scene. You know, there were some edgier things too. You know, Korn was already on the scene. Gosh, who else? I was just talking to, the reason I was talking to my dad was because he was interested in Tears for Fears. Like, I was sending him a Tears for Fears video, and he was like, I didn't know you were a Tears for Fears fan. I was like, yeah, Dad, like, it was everywhere all over the radio. And like, you know, the late 90s, how could you escape it? Which is pretty amazing when you think about, because most of those songs that they recorded were from like the early and mid 80s, but still getting like incredible radio play 10, 15 years later. So Sting was already around and kicking. So yeah, I mean, all those guys. It's pretty much anything they were playing on, you know, the radio here in Houston in the late 90s.
Yeah. So you joined this rock band in high school. So, you know, tell me more about what that experience was like. And how did kind of you and your band members approach like writing music? Were you heavily influenced by what you listened to? Did you take a more experimental approach?
Well, both. I mean, I think, you know, if you were not just a music artist, but any kind of artist, I think it's kind of inescapable that you intake influence from the world around you, and then, you know, put it back out into the world, reformat it, maybe recombine it, you know, do your alchemy and then send it back out. So, you know, I think our creative process, there were four of us. The core group was the four of us, and I think of the four, there were two of us who were really more focused on the creative side in terms of songwriting. But we all contributed to varying degrees. I want to say normally, like if you had to kind of pin down a standard way that we would do songwriting or handle songwriting, I want to say usually then our guitarist may come up with like a riff or something. It was usually guitar driven, honestly. So, you know, our guitarist might come up with a riff, and then, or it could have been me, but usually it might start with a guitar riff and then vocals, you know, after that, and then drum and bass. So, and that is actually a good question, because you know, how you write songs. I mean, I think that's one of those areas where artists all do it really differently. So, but and our way wasn't like especially. There was nothing special about it, I don't think. I mean, you know, our guitarist might get an idea, just hash it out. Sometimes he was working with an idea for months, toying around with it before he would bring it to us. You know, other times we'd just be in the studio, you know, rehearsing or doing whatever, and somebody would accidentally play something, and everybody else would be like, "Oh, that's super cool," you know, and we might go on and turn that into something more significant. So it happened in different ways.
Forgot to ask what was the name of this band?
um, we went through a few name changes, actually. I think when I first joined, I don't remember what their name was when I first joined. They had already been playing and kind of doing their thing for a couple of years at that point. And I remember when I came on, there was a change in the lineup. Like they switched singers. And because I think when I came on, like I don't think they were intending this at first. Like I think they really were just like kind of getting me to fill someone's shoes. But once I actually stepped into the shoes and they realized, okay, this is changing the dynamic, it's going to be something pretty different. I think that inspired them to want to change the name. So the first name that we had that I remember was Sistine, and then and we actually recorded a record under that name, but then inside a year quickly changed it. And I remember there was this like really fun like period where it was probably 2 or 3 months where we were just looking for a new name, and so that was kind of everyone's prerogative or our mission. We were always like messaging each other, like whenever anyone got an idea, we had this little, not a message board because that didn't exist at the time, but like not at least not the same way it does now, but we kind of like we were always messaging each other and calling each other up like, hey, how about such and such. We had this long list, I think like front and back, a couple of pages of different names. And I think we went through a few actually during that period, but finally settled on Fugue, like Fugue State, or Fugue in D minor or whatever, and stuck with that basically for the rest of our years. So we recorded, I think, another record, if I'm remembering right, and then maybe like a demo under that name, I think.
Very cool. In this band, did you have any memorable experiences? Where are some places you performed or gigged at?
Yeah, way too many to name memories. Yeah, we would have to get like your questions would have to get real specific for me to be able to think of a really great memory. I mean, I don't know. I could probably just think of a few random ones. In terms of like where we played, the most characteristic place, of course, would be Cardi's, which is a club that was off Bissonnette that is no longer there. And Cardi's it was a legacy. But most of the clubs were legacy clubs at that time. They had been around since like the 1970s, I think, and were really during the 70s were like a super well-known club in Houston, like one of the top billing clubs. I'm trying to remember who got famous there. Somebody who got famous like played there a lot. I don't remember who it was. Some Texas musician, like maybe ZZ Top. I don't know who it was. And we played there a lot. I mean, I would say that was like our regular place. Like whenever we kind of wanted to do a gig, but just for whatever reason didn't end up booking anywhere else, like that was always our default. And we, there were whole months where we would play shows at Cardi's like once or twice a week. So in terms of, name brand places that we played at, playing the top floor at Fitzgerald's was memorable for us, I think. For a number of different reasons, actually, not just because it was Fitzgerald's. That was also the first time that I got to play with my brother. I think so. He was filling in for a drummer at that concert who had broken his hand a couple of days before, and that was interesting because then my brother had to learn our entire set list in like 24 hours, and he pulled it off. Actually, it was a really great concert. So that one's stands out. And then probably the last concert that we ever played, because it was at the Engine Room, and of course, anybody who was into music, live music in Houston in the 20th century would know the Engine Room because it was like the premier club. So this is before Warehouse, before Verizon, before Minute Maid, before all this stuff. And a lot of really famous musicians actually would come through and play at the Engine Room when they wanted to do a small show. I want to say even as late as like, the 2010s. There were still cats coming through and playing there. So that was outstanding to me because, growing up, I got to see all my heroes play there. And so I got to perform on the same stage. And I remember when we went up there to play that night, you know, and I was backstage before the concert with one of the sound guys, and I specifically asked him, like, hey, you know, he was setting up like some microphone for me to sing on. And I noticed that it was like a pretty standard like cable mic. And I was like thinking, I mean, I was used to singing on mics like that, honestly, but but I told him, I was like, you know, I know that because this is the engine room, and I know that you guys have like a lot of pretty big names up here. And I was here last week and I saw, you know, such and such playing. You know, it was somebody I knew really well. I don't remember who it was, like, you know, maybe the Deftones or somebody, I don't know. And I noticed, and I told him, I was like, I was here last week watching this such and such band play, and I know that you guys have wireless mics because I saw the singer singing with one. So can you show me those? Like, where are those at? And can I use one? And he was like, yeah, sure. I mean, here they are. And he took me over to the side and like showed me a little box, and there were like 3 wireless mics in there, if I remember right. And he's like, one of them, you know, this one is kind of old. Like, we never use this one. Nobody ever uses that one. So I was like, well, okay, it's probably not that, because I want to use the same mic that, you know, that singer was using, like Chino, whoever it was. And so it's one of these two, right? And I was like, do you know which one he probably was using? And he was like, well, you know, I think you know, this one tends to get a little bit better sound when you're trying to do this, and this one tends to get a little bit better sound when you're trying to do this. And because of the kind of band they are, I think he was probably using this one. And I was like, that's the one I want to use. So I got to sing on that mic, and so I like to believe it's a 1 in 2 chance, but I like to believe that that's probably the mic that, you know, those guys were using. my heroes when I was watching them play up on the stage. So that was an outstanding concert for quite a few reasons as well, and that stands out. It was kind of like the culmination for us, you know. Engine Room was like the place that you wanted to get to at the time, more so than Fitzgerald's. Engine Room was like where you wanted to get to, and we had never played there because we weren't big enough, basically. So, but we finally made it right there at the very end. You know, it was real strange, like, right up to the top of the mountain before you jump off.
So what happened? I mean, did you continue on with this band in college, or how did it all, you know, end?
That concert was actually in college. I was already in college and towards the end of college as well. So I want to say I joined in high school. It was between junior and senior year, and then I was in it all the way through about senior year in college. So we were together for about 4 or 5 years there. And that last concert, we knew that it was going to be our last concert too. It's like one of those times in life, you know, where it's like there's so many moving parts and everyone's lives were like changing in a time of transition. So it didn't really continue on, Pat. That was our last concert, and we knew ahead of time it was going to be our last. So you know, it's interesting because I kind of remember having the feeling like, yeah, this is probably going to be our last concert, but I don't actually remember us like advertising like it would be. So maybe I think, you know, there was still some hope that something would continue. You know, I knew that, for instance, after that concert, our bassist wasn't going to be playing with us for much longer, for a couple of different reasons. And I'm trying to remember, I also think maybe we knew that our guitarist was moving as well. And even though he wanted to kind of keep doing it with us, we were like, yeah, you know, we had been playing at that point and working together from 2 different cities at the time. And I think just the prospect of trying to do it from like 3 different cities was just like, you know, that might be too much for us. Like we might try, but I don't know if it's going to work out. So I don't know, like we kind of knew, and at the same time, maybe there was some hope that it would continue on. And for a while, me and the guitarist, the 2 songwriters, actually did keep working together and keep writing songs. And I know we started recording a couple of other demos as well. Never finished them though, you know, just life happens.
So, after this band kind of disbanded, in college, did you have any other like musical pursuits that became kind of your primary focus? I know you worked as kind of an MC, studio engineer, like a DJ. Um,
Yeah, that was I always forget about that actually, because then I would say that was not my primary focus at all. I
okay.
literally was just trying to find a way to keep music in my life in ways that would kind of push the envelope for me personally. Um, because as a performing musician, I hadn't really been behind the soundboard too much, only in the studio, really, only in studio settings. Of course, I'd worked with sound guys a lot, but I had never been the sound guy or the sound engineer. So it was something that I consciously did to try and like teach myself, um, and at the same time see if I could make some money doing it, which I was able to make a little bit, which was nice. But no, I would actually say that for the entire time that I was in that band, that was my primary focus for sure. So, and that was during the time that I was also emceeing. So, it's kind of like when it was like our off time when we weren't rehearsing or performing, or working on a record or a demo. Then I was going out and doing gigs as a DJ or an MC at the same time. So, and that didn't really last beyond college either. I was thinking about that recently and how I never really pursued that. And I don't really know why. I mean, I think, like I said, it was just the time of your life when you're about 20, 21 years old, and just life is crazy. Like things change and things happen very, very fast. So, um, yeah, I actually had that thought recently. Well, maybe maybe that's something that I'd like to do again. Actually, is go out and like run sound, but I don't know. Just as something to do. you know.
And this rock band was your primary focus. So would you say that rock music now is kind of like the genre that you're primarily interested in? Um, or, have you kind of branched out from there? Yeah, I mean, you seem like you've been interested in all sorts of music throughout your life, but
Yeah, I mean, I really started with because I was trained classically. I mean, that was one of the things that was a struggle for me in the rock band early on, actually, was that as a vocalist, a lot of the feedback early on was like, hey, you are way too good. Like, you need to, you know, and like once, people find out I'm classically trained, like we would talk to like people who've been in the biz and stuff, and they told me like, once they found out that I'm classically trained, they were like, you really got to unlearn a lot of that. You really got to unlearn a lot of that, and you got to smoke a lot and drink a lot, and maybe, start, then your voice can start like, so it really was like, I mean, I had to train my voice differently, like very differently. Um, but yeah, I mean, I was classically trained, and what I was hearing at home was a lot of, my dad was really into film music at the same time, so I was hearing a lot of film music at the same time. And my dad, I get a lot of music stuff from both my parents, but a lot from my dad as well. He was the one that kind of had a studio, in our house, so I was very lucky in that way. I mean, I don't think, I don't want to say it's not like we had like some huge like music studio. My house wasn't like that. Um, it really was like a passion project of love for him because he was in a band when he was young, and very big into music. I mean, he still plays today. One of the best things that I've been doing with my life in the past year has been playing with my dad again, actually, and recording music with my dad, which is a lot of fun. Um, and I often say, well, he taught me everything I knows about everything I know about recording, and that's largely true because of the home studio that he built. He's an architect too, so it wasn't just like, we'll slap some equipment together. I mean, it was like a studio. Um, and so what I got from him was a lot of what they termed at the time oldies, but we can call them classics, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, my musical taste like runs the gamut, really. as far in terms of like rock music, I would say it's not necessarily that I feel the most passionate about rock music in particular. I don't really, not any more than other kinds of music, because I do like all kinds of music. I love all kinds of music, and I have performed and recorded all kinds of music. But I will say that rock is probably the thing that I feel most, by now, it's the thing that I probably feel most trained and competent to do, like musically. But you know, like I said, I do other things too.
Makes sense. I mean, just because you've been doing it for so long, and
Like 4 or 5 years, and they were really, yeah. I mean, I performed in madrigal choirs for a long time, like starting from the age of 12 all the way up through, the end of college and beyond. But those 4 or 5 years with the rock band, it's true, it was a different kind of intensity. I don't know if there's like a positive version of PTSD, like maybe that's it. I don't know. A non-traumatic version.
Mhm. So you mentioned that you had to like unlearn a lot of things. So in this band, were you like screaming a lot, or talking about kind of those like coarse vocals, that sort of thing? I'm
Yeah,
assuming.
well, it's so funny that you mentioned screaming in particular and like yelling, because like when I still actually remember the day that they recruited me, like crystal clear. I was crossing the parking lot at the high school, and this was during the summer months. I was going to the high school for some administrative. There was like some day like kids had to show up for some administrative thing, and I was just crossing the parking lot. I think I was going into the school, and the guitarist happened to be coming out, and that's when he stopped me. He was like, "Hey, I saw you performing in this musical recently, um, and you were singing, and you were pretty good. Like, hey, I've got this rock band. Can you Are you interested in singing with us at all?" And I was so tepid at first, because at that point I had never done rock music. I mean, it was all classical, like madrigal church music, and the musical stuff was the most edgy stuff I had done by that point, musical. And so, in my head it was like, oh, rock, I don't even know if I can do that. Like, that's beyond edgy, that's really sharp. I think I have to be really sharp for that. But they were really encouraging. And I remember, I told them, give me a few days to kind of think about it, roll it over, and see what I can do. And I remember they were very persistent, actually. They didn't even let it go 6 hours without accosting me again. And this time the guitarist brought back like the drummer too, and they basically ganged up on me. And I remember specifically the drummer was, because the drummer, so he was the drummer, but he also doubled as a backup vocalist with us, and he also really loved to sing it as well. So he also wrote probably half our lyrics as well. So he was big on vocals. Even as a drummer, the vocals were like, he really cared about the vocals. So that's why I was talking to him about it. And I told him, I was like, well, I'm not sure I want to do this. And I'll tell you the honest truth is because, I'm worried that I will have to do some like real guttural stuff and like some yelling and screaming and stuff. And that's just not me. Like I've never done that kind of thing before musically. And he assured me, and he said, it makes me laugh. He assured me and said, no, absolutely. Like, there is no screaming and yelling in our music. These are the bands that we really like. And he mentioned like some really milquetoast stuff, like, I don't even remember, but it maybe like Creed or something like that, where they never do any yelling, and it's just like, or he cited, I think Incubus too was a big band at the time. And he was like, yeah, see, or 311, for instance, like, see, you don't have to do any like screaming. It's like, we can be really melodic too, and still, kind of edgy and rocky and stuff. And so that was on the strength of that, I was like, okay, I'll do it, and it's so funny because within like a year, probably, or 2 years, we had done like a hard nosedive into like going pretty hard, heavy, you know what I mean? And so I sort of, once the gloves came off, once Pandora's box was opened, it was just kind of like, all bets off, and I went real deep into it. And yeah, I mean, I ended up having to have that conversation with some people in the industry, and they were like, yeah, you're gonna have to unlearn all of that. And like I said, you know, like I say it as a joke, but they were very serious, and it is a serious thing for vocalists. Like they were like, yeah, you know, smoke a lot of cigars, you know, drink a lot of like Coke or whatever, anything that'll tear your throat up, you know, anything that's bad for you. Which is funny also because I got that same advice from my college choir director a couple of years later for church music. Actually, he used to take the bass section out behind the church before every concert and to give us all cigars and say like, hey guys, you know, it's 15 minutes before the concert, I want you guys to smoke these and come back in. We'll have that really nice melodious smooth bass voice, you know. So yeah, you know, I had to unlearn some stuff for the rock music especially, and it was tough actually. I mean, I really did work at it.
Jeez, impressive. um you know, I know, you know, in college you did studio engineering work, MC. You stopped, well, your band disbanded. Do you have any big musical projects after that? Before I get into like your label, like Scorch One Records and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all a natural evolution. It's kind of hard to pinpoint like when things start and stop. So, you know, once Fugue sort of withered away at the end, like I mentioned, the guitarist and I were actually still working together and writing music with the eventual plan that we were going to record a demo and basically form a new band and keep going, keep performing. And I think we actually ended up recording with my brother because by that time he had become a very, very competent drummer, extremely skilled actually. And like I mentioned, that concert at Fitzgerald's, that was the first time he had performed with us. It actually might have been the first time he had performed live. I don't know, I would have to ask him. But by the end of that whole run, like a couple of years later, he was a really good drummer. And so I think, you know, we knew we were losing our drummer. We knew we were losing our bassist. And me and the guitarist were probably going to try to continue on using my brother to fill in for rhythm. And we got kind of like pretty deep into recording a demo, but didn't finish it. Like some life stuff happened that basically made it hard for the guitarist to continue. But I was still going, and my brother was at that point primed and ready. Like we had been in the studio actively working on this demo, right? So as soon as it became clear that the guitarist wasn't going to be able to continue on with us, we had this kind of half-finished demo sitting there, and I still have it. Actually, I still have those masters. But you know, it just seemed kind of a shame to just not play anymore. At that point, it had been such a big part of our lives. So basically, me and my brother decided to continue and go on. Because we lost our guitarist, basically it then just became me and my brother's project, and we reformulated a new concept and started writing some new songs. We started recording with some new musicians, and you know, our goal was basically the same, to just start doing it, you know, writing songs, putting them out, playing shows. Again, like different things happen, life happens, and that didn't quite pan out the way that we were wanting it to either. He left and, you know, was living in Japan and actually touring the world as a drummer for a while I was still back here in Houston. You know, I was carrying the flag while he was away. I actually kept recording and working on some of the projects that we were doing at the time. And there were still a lot of musicians back here in Houston that I was working with at the time too. So it was like, it seemed a natural evolution. Like I said, it's hard to know when it starts and stops. So at some point that turned into the label. So it's really a continuous thing. I don't know, you know? So it's like one project turns into another project. I don't know. But I think at that point though, it's like I had decided pretty much. There was a moment there where I thought about like, well, should I go out and try to do this commercially? Like, should I go on and like, you know, audition for other groups and things like that, and keep, you know, trying to work the record companies or whatever. And I think I just decided at that point, it was like, screw it. You know, I really enjoy music the way that I enjoy it. And like I said, it had a lot to do with like what I was doing with my brother at the time too. We started those recordings, and then what am I trying to say? I guess what I'm trying to say is that the actual project was literally to start a scene, I think. Nothing else really. I mean, we sort of had this half notion that we would play some concerts maybe eventually, and maybe record a record eventually, even though we never really talked about it. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to call that a project exactly, the way that it all happened. I mean, because we didn't really have like the only goal that I know we had in mind, the only actual set goal was like, we're going to write these songs and we're going to record a record, you know. We weren't really thinking beyond that at that point. And then also, you know, to get together, it's like we knew so many people in Houston who were playing music in the alternative scene, you know, and we really wanted to showcase a lot of that talent. So that was our goal, and it was kind of a vague goal, but it was like, we're going to record these songs, you know, maybe record a whole record. And in order to do that, we're going to start a scene essentially and try to showcase a lot of the talent from young musicians, you know, that we know, in the crowds that we know. And eventually that evolved over the years into what later became the label.
So your label, Scorch One Records, you know, you're an indie label. You know, I'm quoting, you do not feel confined to the tethers of the music industry in any way.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about some of the pitfalls of being tethered to the music industry, and why this notion of untetheredness is important to you and the artists under your label.
Sure. Well, I don't think every artist that we work with would probably agree. Actually, I think some of them very much would like to be commercial, but I mean, I think I just mentioned a minute ago, you know, there was a moment in time in my early 20s as the band that I had been playing with and very serious about for a few years was basically dying. And you know, I was still working with a lot of musicians, but it was kind of amorphous. Like I didn't have like a real solid, you know, like the band, it was so well defined, right? Like we always knew what we were doing. And so there was this moment that came in my early 20s as I was at a crossroads, and I basically had to decide, am I going to try and actually do music like, you know, as my bread or as some bread, or, you know, am I going to just like kind of do it and enjoy it? And basically I chose the latter. I mean, I thought to myself, I never went and auditioned for any groups, and I could have, but it's just like, it's so hard to describe without like getting really, really into the details in a gritty way. Like the music scene itself was changing, and the music industry itself was changing. I mean, I was born in 1985, so, you know, all this was happening around 2006, 7, 8, 9, when the internet was basically changing the whole world and the whole human race forever, you know, and that was wreaking havoc with the way that music was consumed, but also artistic styles themselves, right? And there was like I like to say, you know, we can say right now there was like the music world before Kanye West, and then the music world after Kanye West, and because he was basically coming up right at that time. it just was going in a direction that I felt like it was going to be really, really either difficult or just generally unpleasant for me to like actually keep trying to like go the way of music as a business. You know what I mean? As a commercial business. Um, it's like when I was in the rock band, we did try to some extent to make ourselves like, what we might call radio friendly. But towards the end of that, we basically were going off the deep end into like extreme alternative territory. I don't think we cared anymore about being radio friendly, and I think I continued that kind of feeling when I basically like went solo, meaning just free agent. So that's what it means to me. It means not being confined to the tether of the music industry means that I don't have to confine myself to any of the styles that are popular at any given time if I don't want to, right? If I were trying to make music that I wanted to go viral or whatever today, I might be having to do a lot of, say, like what feels like market research, you know what I mean? Whereas I just didn't, I don't feel music in that way. Like I was never in it to just like make money, you know what I mean? So for me, it doesn't matter what other people want, really. And that's what it means to me. Not being confined means that I get to do whatever I please. For better or worse, I guess.
So now, I mean, are you still, creating music under this label like currently, or is
Oh yeah.
this
Oh
okay?
yeah, absolutely. We try to put out at least one new and original piece per month. That's for the whole label because we're pretty small. I mean, so even though I work with multiple artists, I would love every artist that I work with to put out one original composition or performance per month. But it's very difficult, seeing as how we all have day jobs and lives and stuff, like adult lives we have to live, adulting. So one original piece or performance per month seems, at least for right now, seems like what we can handle like pretty competently. Sometimes it's more. I want to say like November last year, 2022, I want to say like I put out 3 or 4 different things. So sometimes it's more, but yeah, it's current and we're still working on it. It's actually, it's so yeah, talking to you, Kevin, has caused me to just like think back and reach back in my memory in many ways. So like the record label is something that me and my brother had always wanted to do since we were kids. And honestly, if we had had the ability, we would have launched it, 10 or 15 years ago. So this is not a new idea that I've had. I mean, this is something that we've actually been working on for a long, long time. Like I said, after college, our goal was basically to try and start a scene. And this label is the natural outgrowth of that just many, many years later. It's like I was just talking to him on the phone yesterday, and we were remembering 2020. Everything shut down in 2020, and everybody was at home for some amount of time in 2020. Me and my girlfriend call it the long spring of 2020. And for, the first time in many years, I had the room, like the mental room and the emotional room, to go ahead and actually just put it on a screen. Like, here's the record company, And ever since then, we've been going pretty strong, about one piece per month. So
There's a lot of cool like rock stuff, some cool like ambient stuff on your label. Listen to some of it. What has been the reception from friends, family, peers, in general, that have navigated?
Really good. Really good. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, really good, generally speaking. I mean, I don't know how else to answer that question. Like some pieces, some artists more so than others, but it just depends on who you ask. I was at like an art opening not too long ago where I had just released a piece and some people were asking me about it, the record company or the record label, and I told them, well, we just released this new piece, like check it out. And I don't remember what piece it was. I think that was one of the months we had several pieces go out, and so I don't know which one they listened to. I still don't know, but I remember their reaction, and they kind of all were huddling around a phone and like listening and stuff. And then they kind of looked up and they were like, "We really love the flute." So I've noticed that a lot of Americans, especially, really respond to the Asian instrumentation, for instance, in our music, whereas they seem less excited about the stuff I would deem more traditionally American. For instance, we've got like a couple of songs on there that are pretty straight rock. You got your 4-piece, like drum, guitar, bass, maybe a second guitar. And sometimes I overall I felt that Americans seem less excited about that, and I think, I don't know what it is. I don't want to say there's like an element of exoticism there, but maybe it's just that a flute is not as commonly heard in pop music. I mean, I know music real well, so I can cite plenty of examples of flute in pop music, but maybe to your average music listener, that's not true. I don't really know. It seems like for most pop music I've heard these days, I don't hear a whole lot of flutes, but
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was talking to a composer last week who he did well, he composes a lot of music that blends together kind of his like Chinese heritage, especially like Eastern, more classical Eastern music. And he was talking about how like some people like maybe there's an element that you can like, oh, it like stands out, kind of like you were mentioning, or yeah, I don't want to say like exoticism either, but I don't know. It's interesting to think about, at least. Yeah.
well, and it's not entirely out of the I would call our like mission statement or our scope, right? At least for that group, Star Empire, which is one that I'm personally involved with. So I record with that project as well. And that's the one where you're primarily going to be hearing a lot of flutes, which are coming from my brother, who is primarily a drummer, but knows a lot of Asian instrumentation besides. And the purpose of that project actually was similar, to bridge our kind of, because my mother, of course, is from Taiwan and my dad is from here, Texas. So that project specifically was created so that we could try to not bridge cultural gaps, but just explore both of those aspects of our culture, and also just to speak to, more generally, to speak to those liminal spaces, right? The intersection of two cultures. So we're not, if you listen to Star Empire, I guess what I mean by that is if you listen to Star Empire, you will not just hear like a mix of, say, Western and Eastern instruments. You'll hear stuff in between too. Like I used a Turkish oud in one song, for instance. Yeah. So
I'd like to move on now to your day job, just teaching. How would you describe, I guess, your approach to teaching? Do you, as someone who has been so invested in music for a long time, do you kind of take a multidisciplinary approach to teaching? Do you kind of expose your students to music and incorporate that in, writing or analysis?
the short answer is yes, absolutely. And often explicitly, especially when I have worked with at-risk students, for instance, at-risk high school students, even at-risk middle school students, even, okay, well, if they're that young, like middle school students, you don't really need a reason. They could be, they could be GT honor students, and we might still use music explicitly just because it's a great learning tool. For older students, if we're in a like a literature course, for instance, I might not necessarily teach music explicitly for on-level or honors, but often for at-risk high school students, yes, I have strong memories of doing that often. It's like for students that don't have don't have an experience, like a background experience of reading books or reading anything to draw on, then very often what we might do to entice them is through music, right? So I have actually explicitly taught as poetry songs by artists as various as Coldplay and Tupac, and many more besides, actually. So, yes, the answer is yes.
Do you have any important teachers in your life that have influenced the way you teach or changed your perspective on teaching?
Probably lots. That's a really good question that I hadn't really ever considered before. Certainly some people that I know and have met, like in my time teaching here in Houston. I can think of probably a couple of different colleagues who have really, really influenced me. But in terms of like historical or public figures, probably lots. And I want to name probably a lot of writers too, because I know a lot of writers have taught as well. I mean, one of my writing teachers, so, Leah Lax, who taught for Imprint here in Houston, and I don't know what she's doing now, but I remember she told me, when I took a seminar with her once upon a time, she was like, all writers teach. So, because I think at the time I was working on just being a writer and kind of struggling, and so I think I was asking her for advice, and she was like, well, all writers teach. And I was like, yeah, I guess here you are, you're my teacher. That makes sense to me. So she was a great influence. And like I say, almost any writer. I mean, I can be really kind of like, I don't want to sound stupid, but like, stuff like guys like Henry Thoreau teach me a lot, because I know even if he was not necessarily a teacher, it's like the guy went on speaking engagements. I mean, that's a kind of like educational activity. You know what I mean? Emerson was known for doing speaking tours as well. I studied the classics as well. So, Cicero, Plato, Aristotle, like they've all had an influence. Peter Abelard. And then a whole lot of people who aren't teachers, of course, have inspired me even in my teaching as well.
Yeah. I guess it is a hard question to answer because,
Well, that's a good question. I would love to answer it more competently. I just hadn't really thought about it before. Like, yeah, who would I pick? I don't know.
No, I think that was a competent answer. I mean, like, because we're affected by, honestly, like everyone we get, or, we're exposed to, whether, physically or academically, or, just by thinking or thought. I like to ask about kind of your education in college. You did kind of like poli-sci and international relation. So did you at one point have an idea of pursuing a future in politics or, affairs like internationally, or what was the reasoning behind that?
Well, so my undergrad education was actually in English literature and religious studies. Um, and the idea was to be a writer, which I did do for a while, actually, after college. And since I was so deep into music at the time, I mean, that's really what it was. It's like I had a choice. Well, do I want to go on and like try to do music, but you know, I also have pretty much prepared myself to go into a career like in journalism or perhaps law. I was trying to leave the door open for those things. And you know, basically, can I it was like, can I do music like full time, or can I kind of, you know, have a really stable and kind of better endowed career, but also keep doing music? And so that was kind of my idea, which is why I did literature and religious studies. It's like I knew I was interested in people, I was interested in social sciences, I was interested in cultures, again, and the intersection of cultures was why I studied those things in college. I wanted to write about it, whether that was through music or through, you know, prose or whatever, poetry, like I would do it. You know, I say I'm a writer, and I've written in a bunch of different mediums. So like I was a journalist for a while, but my first published pieces were actually poems. So I still write poetry to this day as well. I mean, I write lyrics all the time too. So my original idea was actually to be a writer, and then, you know, also keep doing music, and to kind of have those things bounce off each other and complement each other. And it did happen for a few years. I just, you know, before I made the shift to teaching, and I actually did end up going to law school at one point as well. And then it was, I think it was around that time when that shift happened. I basically, after I, you know, after I was in law school and basically decided, you know, yeah, I don't know if I want to actually do law as a career, that's when I kind of decided to go into teaching, a true helping profession for sure. And it was only just in the last few years that I went back and studied political science. So the interest in international affairs has always been there since I was a kid, because of my dual family heritage. And you see that current running through my whole life, you know, music, writing, education, all of it. And teaching as well, honestly.
So you're very talented. I mean, you have a lot of different interests. You've done a lot. And another thing you've done is actually, you know, like mosaic pieces, like mosaic artwork. You know, I actually saw a video online where there's this work of, you know, like mixed media and mosaic works, I think by you and your mother. And you mentioned that like part of your interest in mosaics like comes from an interest in like ancient history and architecture. Can you tell us kind of more about, you know, how this mosaic thing came to start? Are they related to your musical endeavors? And I guess what
Only in the negative.
okay.
I mean, so both my parents are architects, which is where the interest in architecture comes from, and like the sensitivity to architecture. The interest in classical and ancient history, antiquity, you know, whatever kind of history, really. I don't really know where that comes from. I think that was intrinsic to me. Even as a little kid, I was kind of into just hearing stories. I mean, so it's related to my writing, and that's what it is. It's the storytelling aspect of it. I mean, I love stories. I love telling them. I love hearing them. I always have since I was a little kid. And also, to be honest, I think that probably does play a role with music as well, because music is a form of storytelling. So, you know, I think that's where the interest in ancient history comes from. Specifically, like mosaic art comes out of a pretty, how do I say, like abstract interest in particular periods of history. Like when I was 13, I went to Italy, to Pompeii, and we were walking around that dead city for a whole day. And I mean, it wasn't just Pompeii, of course, that's just where it was most apparent, but I mean, I saw ruins throughout Italy while I was there. And so that's really where the mosaic artwork comes from, I think, is its connection to antiquity, and especially Roman civilization, both ancient and medieval. And so, yeah, I mean, storytelling to history, to ancient civilizations, to ancient Mediterranean civilizations, to ancient Mediterranean art forms, maybe is how I got there. And it really came about during my time teaching as a way to blow off steam. I was trying to describe this to people, I think I don't know if I talked about it on that video that you saw. I'm not really sure what video that you saw, but I know I've told people before about how just like, teaching, I guess it depends on the school, but at most, I think public schools, large public schools, I would never describe those places as a place of quietude. You know what I mean? Like, they're usually pretty hectic places. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of energy, a lot of people. And so I think for me, it was a way, doing the mosaic artwork, it's like a really kind of self-contained, intimate activity. You know what I mean? Like, I'm doing it by myself. Usually everything's like dead quiet. It's like, it's literally the opposite of the school day for me, or at least it was at the time when I started. Just a way to kind of relax, and instead of using my mental faculties, it was a way to be kind of tactile, but at the same time I could do it while specifically shutting my brain off, I think. And you can just kind of sit there and relax, and in the quiet. And I mean, I think it sounds like really horrible probably for most people as a pastime, but for me as a teacher, it was like really necessary just to get that quiet space. You know what I mean? That's where it started anyway.
It makes sense. Teaching, well, I don't know where you teach now. Do you still teach at a large public school, or?
No, actually,
Okay.
yeah, no, I've since kind of found ways to reduce that little like kind of mental noise, like including not working at a huge public school.
Got it. Okay. Okay, yeah. I mean, I assume, like, as a teacher, right, like you have a lot to manage, a lot of students. What's like the most difficult thing, or the most difficult challenge that accompanies teaching, like, to you?
Well, I would say maybe just the I would say off the top of my head, I want to say the work itself. I mean, the people don't bother me. I love people, like I said. That's kind of why I got into music and writing in the first place, is I do love conversing with people. I love telling stories. I love hearing them. So, even if I wouldn't necessarily choose to like be in a space where there's just never-ending kind of constant activity. It's like I always used to tell people, most teachers, I know not all teachers, but many teachers are a more quiet kind of people. Like, they're a little bit more introverted than your average, I think. And so it's a really special kind of hell, I think, for a lot of teachers, to put them in that situation where you end up having like in excess of 200 conversations daily, and not just like passing conversations about who won the game or what was happening on the show. Like, in a lot of cases, it could be 200 like life-changing conversations in a single day. And that's just a lot. I think it's a lot for any person to handle, but especially for somebody who's not necessarily used to talking to 200 people per day. You know what I mean? but I wanted to say that's a challenge, but I would say that's not the greatest challenge for me. The greatest challenge, like I said, I think would be the work itself. It's like if you, as a reading, writing, literature teacher today in 2023, my biggest challenge is how do you entice people to want to do something that they don't necessarily see any value in whatsoever. You know, I don't know. That's always a challenge, and it's different for every person.
Uh-huh. And have you ever been inspired by any student you've had in the past or currently?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to say which ones, but yeah, some of the songs that we have written are about students. Yeah, they inspire me all the time, you know, every day, really. Um, in ways that, you know, people might find surprising, and I'm sorry, I can't break that down anymore without getting like kind of detailed and personal, which you know, don't necessarily want to do with other people's, you know, personal stuff. So, but yeah, yeah, every day. I mean, they inspire me, even long after I've known them. Like I said, I mean, I wrote songs about. A lot of times I'll write songs just to remember something, just to make sure that I can, you know, it's like I can always remember stuff that happened by rote, like the fact pattern or whatever. But it's a lot tougher to remember a feeling. You know what I mean? Like I love that those moments when you get a sense memory. You know what I mean? Like when you smell something or you touch something, and it like brings suddenly you just flashback, you know, to a certain place in time and a feeling as well. So a lot of times I'm writing to do that, to preserve a feeling. And so, yeah, I do it quite consciously with some students even, not just students, of course, but it happens with students where, you know, something that we've done, some interaction, something has really inspired me. And I'll say to myself, oh, I really, really want to capture this moment or remember this feeling, not just the person, not just their face, not just the fact pattern, but actually the feeling of what was happening as well. So yes, in a really visceral way, I can still go back and relive those memories, which is nice for me.
I'd like to talk a bit about your heritage and identity and perspectives on that before we close the interview.
Sure.
You know, you identify as like Amerasian. You know, you have a.
Thank you for saying that. You're the first person I've ever heard like use the word Amerasian as a like a semi-official term. I appreciate that.
It's very not like ubiquitous at all. Like I've interviewed like there's like I think the other term is like Hapa, I think, or
I don't know
I'm
that one.
I don't
Great.
I have to check later. I'll let you know. But my question is, you know, how important was celebrating your Asian heritage growing up? And you know, because you mentioned that throughout your life, your dual heritage has kind of been a current in your life. So how did that affect you, and how did you navigate that in your household?
Yes, it was very important, and navigating it not just in my household but in my life has been um, you know, I wish I had something more interesting to say than just interesting, but it's been interesting. I mean, at times it's been kind of difficult. I would say difficult to interesting. I don't really know how else to say that. Yeah, it's been important. It's been important to me. I'm not sure that it truly is important. I think will that remains to be seen. Posterity will ultimately be the judge. For me personally, it's been important. Yes. Um, I don't I don't know how to characterize navigating it though. There have been times when let's say this, there's never been a time when I knew that it was an overt advantage. Let's put it that way. That's never happened. So.
Okay. So I mean, today, do you still kind of celebrate the Asian side of your heritage at all?
Oh yeah, I mean, how can I not? And if we're going back to the music thing, I mean, like, yes, like we're still doing that. Like Star Empire still records, we still write songs, and that's still very much on my mind, like artistically. And even in my writing, I've never had any fiction published, only nonfiction and poetry. But my fiction writing, you can see it very easily. My poetry, it's there. I think poetry tends to be difficult for a lot of people for a lot of reasons that are not mine. But it's there in my poetry too, if one has the eyes for it.
Mm-hmm.
And then music as well. So yeah, I mean, overall, it's just really important, and I still do think about it every day. Yes, and it still impacts my life in many ways every day. That's true.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this idea of this biographical kind of thing where you say you're like an Asian American artist or an Asian artist or insert race here artist or musician, do you think that's important? Do you think art should be kind of detached from the delineations? Is it like limiting in a sense? Is it?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely, it is limiting, but it's all like part and parcel. This is a big discussion. I'm going to try to not like take up too much time answering it, but yes and no, because I think it's like I said earlier, how can artists not take in what's around them? And then when they put it back out, you're getting whatever they took in. So in that sense, I think it's very helpful for musicians geez, this is such a big discussion. If globalization continued to pace, and 1,000 years from now, all the world's cultures were, I heard a linguist say really recently, like this is somebody that's studying, I think, PhD in languages now, and they were saying by the end of the century, what, like 90% of the world's languages will be extinct. You know what I mean? So it's happening quickly, and I guess following that logic, if things keep going the way they are in 1,000 years, if there are no more cultures that can be differentiated, if the earth has a global culture, what is the music going to sound like? What will the art look like? It probably will still be, we'll probably still have really cool things, but it will lose that dynamic that many people find interesting, where you have different cultures interacting and colliding with one another. So in that way, there's good and bad, I think. I mean, it's like you were just asking how if I continue to like think about things like that, and yeah, I mean, I still do, write music or write things that have that cultural dualism in mind, but at the same time, I'm sitting there in like a meeting, and we're talking about curriculum and like what kinds of stories we need to be reading with our students. And somebody says, well, part of the reason these kids aren't doing well right now in this class is because none of the stories that the state is giving them have characters in them that look like those kids, right? So they need to be able to see themselves in the characters of the story, and if they're going to be interested in it. And my response to that is, well, but ultimately that's just gonna handicap people, because part of the whole point of reading, honestly, is to read what it's like beyond the walls of your own mind. You know what I mean? So it's like people who are very, very different than you, we need to be able to get inside their heads too. And you're not going to be able to do that, and you're not going to be trained to do that if you're only reading things starring people just like you. You know what I mean? So I think it's both good and bad, and there is a lot of give and take. And I don't think you know, I'm not going to like call it one way or another because it's just complicated. It's both important and not important. So other thing I wanted to say about that is, so when we were kids, right, like 15, 16, and we were just starting to get into like rock music, it was very important to us. I noticed, is what I wanted to say. I noticed when I looked around, you were asking me at the beginning of the interview about all the bands and groups that we were listening to back in that time in the late 90s. We were very sensitive to the racial makeup of these bands and the cultural backgrounds of the members of all these like bands that were getting put on the radio and were going on all these tours. And I know, you know, I had a bunch of friends who, of course, were not Asian, but I also had friends who were Asian. And for those fellow musicians who were Asian American, we did notice, you know, when there was a band, you know, a video or like on MTV or a concert or a new band or whatever with a member who was of the Asian persuasion. We really did notice that, you know, so it did play a role. And I'm not necessarily proud of that. I don't, you know, it's like, I want to say that that shouldn't be the case. Like in an ideal world, yeah, I mean, it shouldn't matter. But of course, we all know that reality is often at least a few shades away from the ideal. So.
No, I mean, I know exactly what you mean by that. I mean, like, even like personally, like, I mean, I can name like a bunch of bands that I listen to that I know have, you know, like Asian musicians within them, just because it's like, it's just, I don't know, like, it just stands out. Yeah, like, and it shouldn't be like that, but I
Well,
definitely.
and again, this is all part and parcel. Like I said, I don't want to be connected to the tethers of the music industry, and you know, we mentioned that earlier, and this is part of that, because if you walk in, you know, it's same as true today, largely I think, as it was back in the day. Only now it's digital. Back then it was a physical record store, but if you walk into a record store, there are different sections and they're labeled. You know what I mean? Like the music industry is actually funneling specific kinds of music to different audiences, and that's their whole business model, right? They want to profit. That's how they make money. That's one of the ways they make money. And unfortunately, it ends up, I think, a lot of times reinforcing a lot of the, not stereotypes, I mean, yes, stereotypes, but that's not what I mean here. But it reinforces that idea of it mattering. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and I wish it wasn't that way, but at the same time, if it weren't that way, we might lose some creative things as well. But we, you know, if it's like, if we were all gray skinned and listening to exactly the same kind of music all over the world, I'm sure that there are new ways that people would find to be creative as well. So who knows, we probably stand to gain a lot.
Yeah.
As well.
Thanks so much for sharing your perspectives. Before we close off, I'd like to ask, is there anything else you'd like to share? Perhaps anything we didn't cover in the interview?
Oh, no, I mean, you know, anything you guys want to know for the archive, we're good.
Sounds good. Well, thanks so much again for taking the time out of your day. And yeah, I mean, you shared some like great perspectives. It was very interesting to learn about, I guess, your history as an artist and as a musician and your current endeavors as well.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Kevin. This has been awesome. I'm happy to do it.